My name is Amelia Carter. I'm 32 years old. And last Thanksgiving, my parents introduced me to a room full of relatives and business associates as just the maid. They didn't say it quietly. They didn't say it as a joke. They said it proudly, as if shrinking me made them taller. I arrived at my parents' house before noon that day, like I always did. The turkey needed basting. The table settings weren't finished. My mother had miscalculated the seating chart and was already stressed because 2 potential investors had confirmed they would attend dinner. Thanksgiving at our house had never been about gratitude. It was always about image. My older brother, Daniel, was in the living room wearing a tailored navy suit, discussing market expansion with an uncle who once invested in a failed car wash franchise. Daniel had been given an executive title at my parents' company straight out of college. No experience, no track record, just the last name. I, on the other hand, had learned early that competence didn't impress my parents. Visibility did, so I stayed invisible. I tied my hair back, put on an apron, and focused on the kitchen. I've always been good at logistics, timing, structure, anticipating what could go wrong before it does. That skill just happened to become my career, though my parents never cared enough to ask what I actually do beyond. Oh, she works with numbers. Around 5:30, the house filled. Crystal glasses clinked. Expensive perfume mixed with the smell of roasted rosemary and butter. My father stood near the fireplace, holding a glass of wine, laughing louder than necessary. When the first group of distant relatives arrived, my mother waved me over. "Amelia, come say hello." I walked out from the kitchen, wiping my hands on a towel. "This is our daughter," my mother said brightly. Then she added, with a light chuckle, "She's basically the maid today, always helping around the house. We'd be lost without her." There was polite laughter. I smiled. I've practiced that smile for years. It's the kind that doesn't reach your eyes but keeps the peace. Then my father leaned in and made it worse. "She prefers the background," he said. "Not everyone's cut out for leadership like Daniel." More laughter, a few approving nods toward my brother. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Just the old, dull ache of being publicly minimized. It wasn't the first time. When I graduated top of my class with a degree in finance, my father said, "Good. Maybe you can help Daniel with spreadsheets." When I moved to New York for work, my mother told relatives I was trying something temporary. When I was promoted at 29, I sent them an email. My father replied 2 days later with, "Proud of you. Don't forget family comes first." They never once asked what my title meant. They never asked what I handled, what decisions I made, or how many people reported to me. And tonight, as they boasted about the major acquisition their company was about to close, the deal that would supposedly triple their valuation, they spoke as if they alone had orchestrated it. What they didn't know was that I had been in meetings about that acquisition for 4 months. What they didn't know was that their company's financials had raised serious red flags with our risk committee. What they didn't know was that I had argued, professionally, carefully, that their liquidity crisis could still be stabilized if structured correctly. What they didn't know was that nothing about that deal moved forward without my review, but I hadn't told them. Part of me wanted to see how long they would continue underestimating me. Dinner was almost ready when my mother rushed into the kitchen. "He's here," she whispered urgently. I didn't need to ask who. The CEO. The man my parents had been trying to impress for months. The one whose firm had the capital to save their over-leveraged company from collapse. I dried my hands slowly. From the kitchen doorway, I watched as my father straightened his jacket and walked to the front door with exaggerated confidence. The door opened. Voices greeted each other warmly. Then he stepped inside, and instead of looking at my father first, instead of shaking his hand, the CEO's eyes moved past him, directly to me, and he smiled like he recognized exactly who was standing in that kitchen. My mother was still mid-sentence about how our daughter keeps things tidy. The CEO took one step forward. "Amelia Carter?" he said clearly. The room went quiet. "I didn't expect to see you here." For a second, no one moved. My mother's smile froze halfway across her face. My father's hand, still extended for a handshake, hung awkwardly in the air. "Yes," I said calmly, stepping out of the kitchen. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore." He gave a small laugh. "Please, after the last 4 months? Call me Richard." The silence thickened. Daniel looked from me to him and back again, confused. One of the investors cleared his throat. My aunt leaned toward my mother and whispered, "They know each other?" My father recovered first. He forced a chuckle. "Oh, you two have met?" Richard glanced at him, mildly puzzled. "Met? Your daughter runs the acquisition team overseeing your deal." The words landed like a dropped glass. "She runs the deal. Not assists, not supports. Runs." I could almost hear the shift in the room, the recalibration of every assumption made about me in the last 10 minutes. My mother blinked. "I'm sorry. I think there's been some misunderstanding. Amelia works in finance, but she's the lead strategist." Richard continued evenly. "She structured the debt layering, flagged the liquidity exposure in Q2, and negotiated the revised compliance conditions with our board. Frankly, without her, this acquisition wouldn't even be on the table." My father's color drained slowly, like ink diluted in water. Daniel laughed nervously. "That's impressive, but obviously, Dad and I have been in constant communication with your team." Richard's gaze shifted to him, polite, clinical. "Yes, through Amelia." I watched it happen in real time, the fragile architecture of their narrative cracking. For years, my parents had built an image. Daniel the visionary, father the founder, mother the supportive matriarch. I was the background character, the reliable helper, the safe one to diminish. And now the CEO they'd been trying to impress was looking at me with professional respect, the kind I'd never once received at this table. My mother found her voice. "Well, why didn't you tell us, sweetheart?" Sweetheart. The word almost made me smile. "I assumed you knew what I did for a living," I replied calmly. Richard stepped forward and finally shook my father's still hovering hand. "You should be very proud," he said. "Your daughter is one of the sharpest financial minds in the firm." The compliment wasn't exaggerated, it was measured. That made it heavier. My father forced a tight smile. "Of course, we're very proud. But pride has a different tone when it's genuine." This sounded like damage control. Dinner resumed, but the atmosphere had shifted completely. Relatives who had laughed earlier now asked me cautious questions. "So what exactly does a lead strategist do? How large is your team? Is it common for someone your age to oversee deals this size?" I answered politely, clearly, without embellishment. I didn't gloat. I didn't exaggerate. The facts were enough. Daniel barely spoke. He pushed food around his plate, jaw tight. The golden child had just been quietly dethroned, not by drama, but by competence. Halfway through dinner, Richard raised his glass. "I'd like to make a small acknowledgement," he said. Every head turned. We don't usually discuss active negotiations socially, but given the setting, I think it's appropriate to recognize leadership when it's due. He looked directly at me. "Amelia has defended this acquisition more than once in front of a very skeptical board. She believes this company can stabilize, provided certain operational changes are made." "Operational changes?" My father stiffened slightly. Richard continued. "Her recommendation carries significant weight. Ultimately, final approval will depend on her assessment next week." There it was, the piece my parents hadn't known. The deal wasn't guaranteed. It depended on me. The room went utterly silent again, but this time, the silence felt different, not dismissive. "Careful." My mother set down her fork slowly. "Amelia, she said, voice thinner now. Maybe we should talk after dinner. Not command. Request. I nodded once. Across the table, Daniel's eyes burned into mine, not confused anymore, not dismissive. Threatened. For the first time in my life, the power dynamic at that table had shifted, and it hadn't required me to raise my voice. It only required the truth to be spoken out loud. As dessert plates were cleared, my father stood and placed a firm hand on my shoulder. "Sweetheart," he said quietly, forced warmth coating each syllable. "Why don't you come into my office for a minute?" I met his eyes. For years, that office had been where decisions were made without me. Tonight would be different. I stood, and for the first time, they weren't calling me in to help. They were calling me in because they needed me. My father's office hadn't changed in 15 years. Same dark mahogany desk. Same framed photos of milestones. The company's first warehouse. Daniel shaking hands at some ribbon-cutting ceremony. My parents at charity galas. There wasn't a single photo of my graduation. Not from college. Not from business school. I noticed that again as the door closed behind us. My mother stayed standing. My father moved behind his desk, instinctively reclaiming the position of authority. "Explain," he said. "Not how are you? Not, why didn't you tell us? Just explain." I remained near the door. I didn't sit. "There's nothing to explain," I said calmly. "I work in corporate acquisitions. Your company entered our evaluation pipeline 4 months ago." My mother crossed her arms, defensive already. "You could have told us. You never asked." That landed harder than I intended. But it was true. For years, conversations about my life had been surface level, convenient. If it didn't orbit Daniel or the company he was being groomed to inherit. It wasn't urgent. My father leaned back. "If you're involved in this deal, why weren't we notified directly?" "You were notified," I replied evenly. "Through official channels. I'm not assigned because you're my parents. I'm assigned because I specialize in restructuring mid-sized family-owned companies with liquidity exposure." He flinched slightly at that phrase. Liquidity exposure. It sounds technical. Clean. But what it means is this. Your cash flow is unstable. Your debt is heavier than you can comfortably carry. One shock to the system, and everything collapses. Their expansion 2 years ago, Daniel's idea, had been aggressive. New facilities, leveraged loans, a marketing campaign that burned through capital without measurable return. I knew the numbers because I had read every line of them, and I had defended them. That was the part they didn't understand. "You argued for us?" my mother asked, suspicion mixing with surprise. "Yes." Silence. "There were concerns," I continued. "Your Q2 reporting was inconsistent. Executive withdrawals weren't clearly categorized. The board questioned internal oversight." My father's jaw tightened. "Are you accusing us of mismanagement?" "I'm stating facts. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. For the record," I added, "I told them the company's core operations were still profitable, that the instability was strategic, not structural, that it could be corrected." My mother's expression shifted. Not fully soft, but uncertain. "Then why is final approval dependent on you?" she asked. "Because I insisted on conditional oversight." There it was. The part that mattered. The board had been ready to decline. Too much risk. Too much ego concentrated in leadership with too little accountability. I had asked for time. Time to create a revised structure. Time to protect employees who had nothing to do with executive decisions. Time to prevent a collapse that would hurt more than just my parents' pride. But I had attached conditions, and those conditions were not things my father would like. He folded his hands on the desk. "What exactly are you implying, Amelia?" I met his gaze fully now. "That the company can be saved," I said, "but not the way it's currently being run." The words hung between us. My mother inhaled sharply. "This is about Daniel. It's about governance. It's about your brother," she insisted. For years, Daniel's failures had been reframed as learning experiences. His risky decisions were called bold leadership. When projects failed, someone else had miscalculated. Never him. I had watched quietly as capital was shifted to cover mistakes, as personal expenses blurred into corporate accounts, as board oversight was minimized because family handles its own, and I had said nothing. Until now. This isn't personal, I said. It's structural. The acquisition will move forward if executive authority is redistributed and financial transparency is implemented immediately. My father stared at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time. You would leverage your position against your own family? He asked. There it was. The guilt angle. I felt it. The old instinct to retreat. To soften. To make myself smaller so they could feel bigger. But something inside me had shifted at that dinner table when they called me the maid. No, I said quietly. I'm protecting the company and the employees who depend on it. And if we refuse? My father asked. I didn't hesitate. Then the board will decline the acquisition. The words were steady, controlled, but they carried weight. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the background character in this room. I was the variable that determined their future. My mother lowered herself slowly into the chair across from the desk. What do you want? She asked, voice no longer sharp, just careful. I didn't answer immediately, because this wasn't about revenge. It was about something far more difficult. Boundaries. And for the first time, they were the ones waiting for my terms. For most of my life, I had waited outside that office door. Waited while my father and Daniel discussed important matters. Waited while decisions were made. Waited to be invited into conversations that never came. Now they were waiting on me. I walked toward the chair across from my father's desk and sat down slowly, deliberately, not rushed, not emotional, measured. You asked what I want, I said. I want the company stabilized, properly. My father exhaled sharply. Stop speaking like a consultant. Speak like my daughter. I held his gaze. If you had treated me like your daughter tonight, we wouldn't be having this conversation. That silenced him. My mother pressed her fingers together on her lap. Amelia, the maid comment was a joke. No, I said gently. It wasn't. I didn't say it with anger. I said it with clarity. You've introduced me like that before. Just not in front of someone whose opinion mattered to you. The truth was uncomfortable. I could see it in the way my father's eyes shifted. For years, I had absorbed those comments quietly. Tonight, I simply refused to carry them anymore. This deal, I continued, returning to the practical, can move forward under 3 conditions. My father's posture straightened slightly, instinctively bracing. First, I said, executive authority must be redistributed. Daniel cannot retain unilateral operational control. My mother stiffened immediately. Absolutely not. It's non-negotiable, I replied calmly. His expansion strategy over-leveraged assets without adequate contingency reserves. The board won't approve further capital under the current structure. My father's jaw tightened. He's learning, at the company's expense. Silence again. Second, I continued, all executive withdrawals must be categorized and disclosed. No more blurred lines between personal and corporate spending. My father's expression darkened. Are you auditing us now? Yes, I said simply, because the board will. That was the difference between us. They saw this as family. I saw it as liability. Third, I finished. A formal governance agreement must be signed acknowledging oversight from our firm for the next 18 months. My mother's eyes widened. You want control. I want accountability. My father stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the dark yard. I could see the calculations running through his mind. Pride versus survival. You're asking me to sideline my own son, he said quietly. I'm asking you to protect your company. He turned around. And what do you get out of this? There it was. The assumption that everything is transactional. I get to do my job, I said. And I get to stop watching this company collapse because no one is willing to admit mistakes. My mother's voice softened slightly. You could have told us, warned us privately. I tried, I replied. 2 years ago, when I mentioned debt ratios at dinner, when I suggested hiring an external auditor, you said I was being dramatic. Neither of them responded, because they remembered. For a moment, the room wasn't about power anymore. It was about history. Years of being spoken over, years of being minimized, years of Daniel's ideas being called visionary, and mine being called cautious. Finally, my father returned to his desk and sat down slowly. If we agree, he said carefully. The acquisition goes through? If the board votes in favor after reviewing compliance adjustments, yes. And if we don't? The deal ends next week. I didn't threaten. I didn't lean forward dramatically. I simply stated reality. My mother looked at me with something I couldn't quite name. Not resentment. Not pride. Recognition. You've already decided, she said quietly. Yes. The hardest part wasn't asserting authority. It was not wavering under guilt. My father rubbed his temples. You realize what this does to Daniel? I met his eyes again. For years, I said evenly, you've protected him from consequences. You never protected me from humiliation. The words weren't cruel. They were factual. The difference mattered. Another long silence settled over the room. Outside, laughter drifted faintly from the dining room, relatives unaware that the future of the company was being negotiated behind closed doors. Finally, my father asked the question he had been avoiding since the moment Richard said my name. Is this about revenge? I shook my head slowly. If it were revenge, I said, I would walk away. That was the truth. Walking away would have been easier, but I wasn't here to destroy them. I was here to draw a line. My father looked at my mother. My mother looked back at him. For the first time, they weren't deciding for me. They were deciding because of me. And they both knew something that had never been true before tonight. They had no leverage left. My father's voice was quieter when he spoke again. If we agree, this stays professional? Yes. No family disputes brought into boardrooms? No. And you won't humiliate us publicly? I held his gaze. I already had the opportunity to, I said. I didn't. That, more than anything, shifted the air in the room. He nodded once, slowly. Then we'll discuss restructuring. Not enthusiastic, not gracious, but accepting. And as I stood to leave that office, I realized something that felt heavier than victory. They hadn't chosen me. They had chosen survival. And for the first time in my life, that was enough. When we walked back into the dining room, the energy had changed. Conversations lowered as soon as my parents appeared beside me. Daniel was standing near the fireplace, speaking too quickly to one of the investors, his smile tight and brittle. He stopped mid-sentence when he saw our faces. Richard was still seated at the head of the table, calm, observant. He didn't look surprised. He looked patient, like a man who had seen this exact moment play out in other families before. My father cleared his throat. That sound alone was enough to command attention. It always had. I'd like to clarify something, he began. My mother stood beside him, posture rigid but composed. Earlier that evening, this same man had laughed while calling me background. Now his voice carried something unfamiliar. Carefulness. Our daughter, he continued, is not just helping around the house. A few relatives shifted awkwardly. She is the lead strategist overseeing the acquisition of this company. The words came out stiffly, but they were correct. Daniel's head snapped toward him. Dad! My father raised a hand slightly, silencing him without looking. She has played a central role in negotiating the terms currently under review. It wasn't a warm tribute. It wasn't poetic. But it was public acknowledgement. And that mattered. My mother stepped forward then, her voice softer but steady. We are proud of her achievements and grateful for her professional guidance. Grateful. The word tasted strange in the air. Across the table, I saw my aunt's expression shift from mild amusement to something closer to respect. One of the investors nodded slowly, recalculating his earlier assumptions about who held influence in this family. Daniel didn't sit down. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "We've been running this company for years. Now suddenly she's in charge?" "No," I said calmly, before anyone else could respond. "I'm not in charge of the company. I'm overseeing whether it qualifies for investment. There's a difference. Precision matters." Richard finally stood, glass in hand. "For clarity," he said smoothly, "Amelia's recommendation will determine whether our board proceeds next week. Her evaluation is based on compliance adjustments discussed privately this evening." Compliance adjustments, another subtle reminder. The room went quiet again, but this time, it wasn't shock. It was awareness. Daniel turned to me fully now. "So what? You're threatening to tank us if I don't step aside?" His voice carried frustration, but also fear. "I'm requiring structural changes," I said evenly, "for the protection of the company. You're my sister, and this is business." That line landed harder than anything else I had said all night. Because it wasn't emotional, it was boundary. Daniel looked to our parents for reinforcement, the way he always had. This time, they didn't step in to shield him. My father spoke instead. "We'll be reviewing executive responsibilities," he said, tone firm. "Effective immediately." Daniel stared at him as if he'd been betrayed. Maybe he had, but not by me. By reality, my mother reached for a wine glass with slightly unsteady fingers. I could see the internal conflict in her eyes, the instinct to protect her son battling the understanding that protection had consequences. Richard set his glass down. "I've worked with many family businesses," he said thoughtfully. "The successful ones separate emotion from governance. It's uncomfortable, but necessary." No one argued, because everyone in that room knew he was right. My father turned to me then. "There will be a formal restructuring meeting tomorrow," he said. "We'll cooperate fully." It wasn't an apology, but it was compliance. And that was more powerful. Dinner resumed slowly after that. But the tone had permanently shifted. No one laughed at me again. No one called me helpful or background or convenient. They asked me questions instead, real ones. About projections, about oversight, about long-term sustainability. Daniel left the table early. I didn't follow. For years, I had chased approval in that house. Tonight, I didn't need to. After dessert, as guests began gathering coats, Richard approached me quietly. "You handled that with restraint," he said. "I wasn't trying to embarrass them," I replied. "I know," he said. "That's why the board trusts you." Trust? The word settled into me differently than praise. Because trust isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It's steady. When the last guest left and the front door finally closed, the house felt unfamiliar, quieter, smaller. My father stood in the hallway for a moment before speaking. "You'll send the revised compliance draft in the morning?" "Yes," he nodded once. No sarcasm, no dismissal, just acknowledgement. As I gathered my coat, my mother approached me hesitantly. "Amelia," she said softly. "We didn't realize." She didn't finish the sentence. "You didn't realize what? That I was capable? That I was significant? That I was watching?" "I know," I said gently. That was enough. When I stepped outside into the cold night air, something inside me felt lighter. Not triumphant. Not vindicated. Just clear. I hadn't destroyed them. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't exposed them recklessly. I had simply refused to be reduced. And next week, when I walked into that boardroom to deliver my final recommendation, it wouldn't be as someone's daughter. It would be as the person who runs the deal. Type continue when you're ready for the final part, the decisive ending. 1 week later, I walked into the boardroom with a folder that carried more than numbers. It carried history. My name is Amelia Carter. I'm 32 years old. And for most of my life, I thought strength meant staying quiet to keep the peace. I was wrong. The restructuring documents had arrived 2 days earlier. Signed, Not happily, but fully executed. Daniel had been reassigned to a non-executive development role under external supervision. Independent financial oversight had been contracted. Executive withdrawals were itemized, categorized, and capped. Governance reform was in writing. They complied, not because they suddenly understood me, but because they understood risk. The boardroom was bright, controlled, impersonal. Nothing like my parents' dining room filled with forced laughter and fragile pride. Richard sat at the far end of the table. 8 other board members flipped through the compliance packet I had prepared. "Amelia," one of them said, adjusting her glasses. "You've reviewed the revisions personally?" "Yes." "And you're satisfied the governance risks have been mitigated?" "Yes." There was no hesitation in my voice. Because this wasn't about family anymore. It was about viability. Another member leaned forward. "Your original assessment was cautious but supportive. Has anything changed?" I paused for exactly one breath. "Yes," I said. "Accountability has been implemented." That was the difference. The vote was taken 10 minutes later. 8 in favor, 1 abstention, none opposed. The acquisition was approved, not because they were my parents, not because of sympathy, because the numbers made sense. When the meeting adjourned, Richard lingered. "You could have walked away," he said. "I considered it, but you didn't." "No," I replied, "because employees would have paid the price for executive pride." He studied me for a moment, then nodded once. "You're going to go very far in this industry." I didn't smile. I wasn't thinking about far. I was thinking about boundaries. That evening, my father called. His voice was different than it had ever been. Quieter, less inflated. "The board approved," he said. "Yes." A pause. "Thank you." 2 words. They shouldn't have felt monumental, but they did. "I didn't do it for you," I replied honestly. "I know," he said. And for the first time, there was no defensiveness in it. "We'll adjust." That was as close to growth as I expected. Daniel didn't call, but I heard through internal reports that he attended his new oversight meetings without argument. Whether it was humility or necessity, didn't matter. Consequence had finally entered the room. The following year, Thanksgiving looked different. Not because my parents changed completely. People don't transform overnight. But because I did, I hosted dinner in my own apartment. Smaller table, fewer guests, no performance. Richard sent a polite decline, traveling that week. But a handwritten card arrived instead. My parents came. They arrived on time. They brought wine. My mother offered to help in the kitchen. I let her, not as punishment, not as irony, but as balance. During dinner, there were no jokes about maids, no comparisons, no subtle reductions disguised as humor. At one point, my father cleared his throat. A familiar habit. "This is impressive," he said, gesturing around the room. "You've built something solid." He wasn't talking about the meal. I met his eyes. "Yes," I said. I had not just a career, not just authority, but self-respect that didn't require their validation. And that was the decisive shift. Because here's what I learned. Power isn't raising your voice in a room that dismisses you. Power is staying calm when the truth speaks for you. They once told everyone I was just the maid. But when the deal closed, when governance shifted, when survival depended on competence, they learned something simple. I was never background. I was the one holding the pen. 3 months after the acquisition closed, the first quarterly oversight report came in clean. No unexplained withdrawals, no rushed expansion proposals, no emergency liquidity patches disguised as strategic pivots. For the first time in years, the company wasn't scrambling. It was stabilizing. I reviewed the report alone in my office, sunlight stretching across the conference table. My name was printed at the top under Lead Oversight Authority. Not daughter, not helper, not background. Authority. Daniel attended every compliance meeting. He didn't argue anymore. He asked questions now, careful ones. I could see the shift in tone during our calls. Less entitlement. More listening. It wasn't warmth, but it was growth. My parents adjusted too, in their own restrained way. They stopped introducing me as good with numbers. They began saying, "She oversees acquisitions." Simple sentence, massive difference. But the real change wasn't in them. It was in me. Because here's the part no one talks about after the dramatic dinner: the public correction, the decisive vote. Respect isn't a moment. It's maintenance. There were still small tests. My mother once suggested at lunch, "Maybe next year Daniel can ease back into executive control." I looked at her calmly and said, "Governance isn't seasonal." She didn't argue. That was new. My father tried once to frame the restructuring as a joint family effort during a networking event. I corrected him politely. "It was a board-mandated adjustment." He nodded. Also knew I didn't fight anymore. I clarified, and clarity became the boundary. A year after that Thanksgiving, the company's valuation had doubled, not because of risk, because of discipline. At the annual shareholder gathering, my father stood at the podium and thanked the oversight team publicly. Then he did something he had never done before. He stepped aside. "Amelia," he said into the microphone, "would you like to address the room?" There was no hesitation in his voice, no reluctance, just acknowledgement. I walked to the stage slowly. No dramatic music, no cinematic spotlight, just steady footsteps. I spoke about sustainability, about ethical leverage, about how family businesses fail not from lack of ambition, but from lack of accountability. I didn't mention Thanksgiving. I didn't mention the Maid comment, because I no longer needed to. After the event, one of the longtime employees approached me. "Thank you," she said quietly. "When the expansion went wrong, we were scared. Now it feels stable." That meant more than any apology ever could. Because this was never about humiliating my parents. It was about protecting people who didn't get a vote in executive pride. That night, I drove home alone. Not angry, not triumphant, just steady. I thought about that moment a year earlier, standing in my parents' dining room, hearing laughter after being reduced to something small. If the CEO hadn't spoken up, would I have? Yes, eventually, because silence protects the wrong people. And competence doesn't need permission. My name is Amelia Carter. I'm 32 years old. My parents once told everyone I was just the maid. But here's what they learned, and what I finally understood. You don't prove your worth by shouting. You prove it by holding the line when the decision is yours. And when the pen is in your hand, you sign only what respects you back.